They say that if you stand long enough in the absolute silence of the high peaks, you can hear the heartbeat of the world. I didn't believe it until I saw the man who had stopped his own. I had spent a decade navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican's secret archives, a place where history goes to die and silence is the only currency. My hands had touched letters from emperors, decrees of inquisitors, and maps to lands that no longer exist. But everything I had ever read was merely a shadow, a curated lie designed to keep the structure of the world intact. The truth, I discovered, wasn't hidden in a vault in Rome. It was breathing in a place where the air is too thin for most men to survive. The ascent to the monastery of the Last Keepers, perched like a jagged tooth on a nameless spire in the Caucasus, took 22 days of physical agony. The wind there doesn't just blow, it screams with the voices of 1,000 forgotten centuries. My guide, a man whose face was a map of scars and sun-bleached wrinkles, had left me at the base of the final precipice. He wouldn't go further. He claimed that the monks there weren't men anymore, but vessels for a fire that would consume anyone who came seeking only curiosity. I wasn't seeking curiosity. I was seeking the end of the world as I knew it. When I finally crested the ridge, the monastery didn't look like a building. It looked like the mountain itself had decided to dream in stone. There were no gates, no guards, only a single archway carved with symbols that predated the flood. Standing beneath that arch was a figure so still I thought he was a statue. He was draped in robes the color of dried blood, and his eyes, God, his eyes, didn't look at me. They looked through me, as if I were a ghost, and he was the only thing truly alive. "You are late, Julian," he said. His voice wasn't loud, yet it vibrated in my marrow, bypassing my ears entirely. He spoke in a dialect of Aramaic so ancient it sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. "How do you know my name?" I gasped, my lungs burning from the altitude. "The wind carries the scent of Rome," he replied, turning with a fluidity that defied his apparent age. "It smells of incense and old paper, of secrets kept until they rot, and of a fear that has lasted 1,700 years. You have come for the breach." He didn't wait for an answer. He led me through narrow corridors where the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic luminescence. There were no lamps here. The light seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, or perhaps from the intensity of the thoughts that had occupied this space for millennia. We descended into the heart of the mountain, into a chamber that smelled not of decay, but of ozone and fresh earth. "My name is Brother Malachi," he said, gesturing toward a table of blackened oak. "And I am the last man who remembers what the world was before it was edited." I sat, my hands trembling. On the table lay a manuscript that made the Vatican's most precious codices look like children's sketches. The vellum was thick, almost like leather, and the ink was a deep, iridescent violet that seemed to move when I blinked. "You think you know the story of the Christ?" Malachi began, his hands folding over the manuscript with a reverence that felt like a ritual. "You think you know the Council of Nicaea, the gathering of bishops in 325 AD who decided what was holy and what was heresy. You've read the history books, the ones written by the winners. They tell you it was about unity, about establishing a common faith for a crumbling empire. But unity is just a polite word for the eradication of the inconvenient." He leaned forward, the shadows in the room deepening. "The bishops didn't just vote on books, Julian. They voted on the nature of reality. They saw that the teachings of the Nazarene were not a religion, but a technology, a way to bridge the gap between the human consciousness and the architecture of the universe. That kind of power cannot be governed. You cannot tax a man who knows he is a god in exile. You cannot control a population that understands that the temple is not a building, but the very frequency of their own breath. So they changed it, I whispered. They did more than change it, Malachi said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. They severed the connection. They took the logos, the word, and they turned it into a law. They took the pneuma, the spirit, and they turned it into a ghost. And the books that explained how to use that power, they were hunted with a ferocity that makes the later inquisitions look like a minor disagreement. They were burned, buried, and erased from the collective memory of the West. But they forgot that the mountains do not obey the laws of Rome. He opened the manuscript. The script was a variant of Syriac, but interspersed with mathematical symbols and geometric patterns that looked like the blueprints for a star. This is the grammar of the first breath, he said. The world knows parts of it as the Book of Enoch, or the secret Gospel of Mark, or the Gnostic fragments found in the Egyptian sands. But those are just the crumbs. What we have kept here is the feast. We have kept the version of the story where the resurrection wasn't a unique miracle performed by a divine being to prove his authority, but a demonstration of a biological and spiritual potential inherent in every human being. I looked at the pages, and for a moment, the symbols seemed to lift off the vellum and spin in the air. My head throbbed. Why hide it for so long? If this could change humanity, why let us suffer in the dark for nearly 2,000 years? Malachi's face darkened, a flash of ancient sorrow crossing his features. Because a tool is only as good as the hand that wields it. In the 4th century, the world was obsessed with blood and iron. If we had released the grammar then, the emperors wouldn't have used it to liberate souls. They would have used it to build a more efficient hell. We became the keepers of the silence, waiting for the moment when the institutional structures would finally fail, when the truth of the powerful would become so obviously hollow that the people would have no choice but to look into the abyss for something real. He stood up and walked to a shelf lined with jars of clay and scrolls of silver. Rome built a Christianity of stone and fear. They built cathedrals to make you feel small. They created a priesthood to make you feel distant from the divine. They told you that salvation was a legal transaction, that you were born in debt, and only they held the ledger. It was the most successful psychological prison ever constructed, and it worked for 17 centuries because it promised safety in exchange for your sovereignty. But the safety is gone, I said, thinking of the world I had left behind, a world of collapsing certainties and digital shadows. Exactly, Malachi replied. The walls of the prison are cracking. The hierarchy is losing its grip because the technology of the world has finally caught up to the magic of the ancients. People are no longer afraid of the dark. They are afraid of the emptiness. They are ready to hear what happened during those 40 days after the tomb was found empty. He pulled a heavy, iron-bound volume from the shelf. It didn't look like a book of prayer. It looked like a weapon. The canonical Gospels give you a few verses of post-resurrection appearances. A walk on a road, a meal of fish, a vanishing act into the clouds. It is an insult to the intelligence of the seeker. Jesus didn't spend 40 days performing parlor tricks. He spent 40 days delivering the final protocol, the instruction manual for the transition of the human species. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the Mashafa Kadan I had heard whispered about in the darkest corners of the Vatican library. But this was more. This was the source code. He taught them that the body is not a vessel to be discarded, but a frequency to be tuned, Malachi continued, his eyes glowing with an inner light. He taught them the prayer of the noosphere, the method by which a single mind can influence the probability waves of the physical world. He taught them that the kingdom of heaven is not a place you go when you die, but a state of hypercoherence you achieve while you are alive. And he warned them that the powers of the world, the archons of the political and religious systems, would do everything in their power to ensure this knowledge was forgotten. I reached out, my fingers inches from the iron-bound book. Show me the first protocol. Malachi smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold clarity of a man who has seen the beginning and the end. Be careful, Julian. Once you read the grammar, you can never go back to being a ghost. You will be hunted, not by men in robes, but by the very system of reality you currently call home. Are you ready to stop being a spectator in your own life? Продолжаю повествование. Это второй блок истории, в котором мы углубимся в саму суть запретного знания и столкнемся с первым испытанием героя. Текст становится более плотным и насыщенным деталями. Это блок 2 из 3. The Geometry of the Soul. I reached out and touched the iron-bound volume. The metal was ice cold, but the moment my skin made contact, a jolt of static electricity snapped through my arm, leaving the taste of copper in my mouth. Malachi watched me with the detached intensity of a surgeon. As I pulled the book toward me, the heavy cover groaned on its hinges, revealing pages that were not made of vellum, but of a translucent, glass-like substance that felt like frozen silk. The script wasn't written on the surface. It was suspended within the material, shimmering with a life of its own. The first protocol was titled, The Resonance of the Unobserved. It didn't start with a prayer or a commandment. It started with a diagram of the human nervous system, but it was mapped as a series of interlocking harmonic scales. The text explained that the fall of man wasn't a moral failure in a garden. It was a sensory collapse. It described how the human mind had been detuned by the noise of the material world, by fear, by the hunger for power, and by the very structures of language that Rome had later used to codify the faith. Read the passage on the breath, Malachi commanded, pointing to a cluster of symbols that looked like a cross between a musical score and a chemical formula. I began to translate, the words forming in my mind with a clarity that felt invasive. The breath is not merely the exchange of air, but the rhythm of the interface. When the rhythm is broken, the soul becomes a prisoner of time. When the rhythm is restored, time becomes a tool of the soul. The text detailed a specific sequence of breathing and visualization that was designed to bypass the amygdala, the part of the brain that governs fear. It claimed that by silencing the biological static, a person could begin to perceive the underlying data stream of reality. This was the direct revelation the Ethiopian monks had guarded. It was a methodology for self-deification, or at least for the reclamation of a lost state of being. I realized then why the Vatican had worked so hard to bury this. If a man could regulate his own consciousness, if he could achieve a state of hypercoherence through his own internal mechanics, the entire edifice of the church became obsolete. There would be no need for a confessor if there was no sin other than ignorance. There would be no need for a savior if the path to the divine was already hardwired into the anatomy of the human brain. The shadow of the empire. As I delved deeper into the manuscript, the air in the chamber grew heavy, as if the mountain itself was leaning in to listen. Malachi stood by the silver scrolls, his silhouette cast long and jagged against the rock walls. "You must understand the stakes, Julian," he said, his voice echoing in the silence. "The men who met at Nicaea weren't just theologians. They were the architects of a global consensus. They knew that human belief is a form of gravity. If you can control what people believe is possible, you control the boundaries of their world. They rejected these texts not because they doubted their authenticity, but because they feared their efficacy. They wanted a God who was a distant judge, a monarch in the sky, because that justified a monarch on the throne. A Christianity based on the 40 days would have been a world of individuals who recognized no king but the truth within themselves. But Rome fell, I countered, looking up from the glowing pages. The empire is dust. Why does the secret still need to be kept? Rome didn't fall, Malachi snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden fierce light. It merely changed its wardrobe. The empire became the bank. The legion became the algorithm. The desire to control the human spirit hasn't diminished. It has only become more sophisticated. Today, they don't burn books. They drown them in a sea of triviality. They don't execute heretics. They distract them until they forget they have a soul. The archons are still very much in power, and they are terrified of what happens when the silence is broken. He walked over to a small, circular window that looked out into the void of the night. For 1700 years, we have been the exception. Ethiopia remained independent because its kings recognized that the true treasury of the nation wasn't gold, but this knowledge. We fought off the Italians, we endured the revolutions, and we kept the fire burning in the dark. But now, the dark is coming for us. The digital age is a net that is being cast over the entire planet. There are no more hidden places left. Even here, the satellites are watching. The frequency of the world is becoming so loud that even the monks are starting to lose the rhythm. The first breach. Suddenly, a low, vibrating hum began to resonate through the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the mountain. It was the sound of machinery, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that felt like a predator's purr. Malachi froze. His hand went to a heavy, iron key hanging at his belt. "They are here," he whispered. "Who?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "The church?" "The inheritors of the empire," he replied. "They have been tracking your movements since you left the archives. You thought you were being clever, Julian, but you are a child playing with fire in a house made of dry grass. Your academic curiosity has acted as a beacon." He grabbed the manuscript from the table and shoved it into a leather satchel. "There is a passage beneath the altar. It leads to the lower cliffs. You must take the grammar and go." "I can't leave you," I protested, the adrenaline finally surging through my system. "I am a relic of a world that is ending," Malachi said, his voice calm, almost clinical. "You are the bridge. If they take the grammar, they will use it to finish the net. They will turn the first breath into a final chokehold. They will map the soul only to better exploit it. You must ensure that the knowledge is released not to the institutions, but to the people. It must be scattered, Julian, like seeds in a storm. If one person can achieve the resonance, the entire system begins to fail." The thrumming grew louder, and then came a sound that chilled me to the bone. The rhythmic, metallic clatter of a drone's rotors. A beam of blindingly white light cut through the small window, scanning the room with surgical precision. The archons weren't coming with torches and swords. They were coming with LiDAR and thermal imaging. "Go!" Malachi shouted, shoving me toward a hidden door behind a tapestry of the Virgin. "Remember the protocol. Breathe. Don't look at the light. Look through it." I stumbled into the darkness of the tunnel, just as the sound of breaking stone echoed through the chamber above. My vision was a blur of shadows and geometric ghosts. I clutched the satchel to my chest, feeling the warmth of the manuscript through the leather. As I scrambled down the narrow, damp stairs, I realized that I wasn't just running for my life. I was carrying the only thing that could make life worth living in the world that was coming. The tunnel opened onto a narrow ledge, suspended thousands of feet above the valley floor. The wind was a physical wall, threatening to hurl me into the abyss. Above me, the monastery was illuminated by the hovering lights of 3 sleek black drones. They looked like giant, predatory insects, their sensors glowing red as they searched for the anomaly in the mountain's heat signature. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the symbols from the page, the resonance of the unobserved. I focused on my breath, forcing the rhythm to slow, to deepen, to match the vibration of the rock beneath my feet. I didn't try to hide from the drones. I tried to become part of the mountain's own frequency. For a terrifying moment, the red light of a drone passed directly over me. I felt the heat of its scan, the invasive touch of its technology. But I didn't flinch. I held the rhythm. I became the stone. The light moved on, and the drone drifted toward the other side of the ridge. It had worked. The technology of the Nazarene had bypassed the most advanced sensors on the planet. I wasn't a ghost. I was a ghost in the machine. I began the descent, my hands finding grips in the dark that I couldn't possibly see. Every step was a prayer. Every breath was a rebellion. I had to reach the village. I had to find a way to the world's digital nervous system and upload the virus of truth before the empire could close the gap. The transmission of the unseen. The descent from the monastery was not a flight. It was a transmutation. With every jagged step down the mountain's spine, the grammar of the first breath felt less like a physical weight in my satchel and more like a resonant frequency humming within my own DNA. I understood now what the Ethiopian order had preserved while the rest of the world was busy building walls. The archons, the invisible architects of the global consensus, were hunting me with thermal sensors and signal interception arrays, but they were looking for a man who didn't exist anymore. By following the monk's instructions on the resonance of the unobserved, I had moved beyond their narrow definition of reality. When I reached the village at the base of the cliffs, it was already bathed in the cold, blue light of a pre-dawn military operation. Black SUVs with tinted windows and unmarked tactical gear sat idling in the square. They were waiting for a scholar, a man of letters who would try to hide in the shadows. They didn't realize that the greatest hiding place in the universe is the light itself. I found a small, derelict internet cafe, a relic of the early 2000s that still functioned on a satellite uplink. The air inside smelled of dust and burned circuits. As I sat at the flickering terminal, I opened the satchel. The iron-bound volume seemed to pulse with an internal urgency. I wasn't just going to upload a text. I was going to release a living wisdom that had been kept in darkness for 17 centuries. The protocol of the 40 days. As the data began to climb the uplink, I finally allowed myself to read the core of the Mashafa Kadan, the teachings of the 40 days. The canonical Gospels, the versions Rome had approved at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, were intentionally truncated. They ended with a brief commission, a vanishing act that left the disciples staring at the sky, waiting for a future return. But the Ethiopian tradition held the truth. Those 40 days were the most important period in human history. In the text before me, Jesus didn't speak of hierarchies or taxes or the authority of bishops. He spoke of a mystical transformation. He taught that the resurrection wasn't a unique event to be worshipped from afar, but a demonstration of the permeable boundary between the human and the divine. "You have heard that the kingdom is coming," the text whispered in my mind. But I tell you, the kingdom is not a place or a time. It is a quality of consciousness. It is within you, around you, and always present. The instruction was clear. The institutional church had rejected these books because they made the clergy less essential. Rome needed people who would obey an emperor and follow a law. They couldn't control a man who practiced constant awareness and saw the divine presence in the face of the poor and the songs of birds. The forgotten word wasn't a secret doctrine. It was the realization that the temple was the human heart. The collapse of the consensus. Outside, the door to the cafe was kicked open. 3 men in tactical gear entered, their weapons raised. But as they looked toward the corner where I sat, they paused. I could see the confusion in their movements, the way their eyes scanned the room and skipped over my chair as if it were a blind spot in their vision. I was holding the rhythm. I was breathing the first breath. "Where is he?" One of them barked into a radio. "The thermal signature just vanished." I didn't move. I watched the progress bar on the screen. 98%, 99%, 100%. In that moment, the information wasn't just on a server. It was in the air. The grammar was now part of the world's digital nervous system. The silence that had lasted 1,700 years was officially over. The leader of the team, a man with a cold, analytical gaze that reminded me of the Vatican inquisitors, walked toward my terminal. He stopped inches from me. He reached out his hand, searching the space where my shoulder should be. I felt the heat of his breath, the metallic scent of his equipment. But the Archon couldn't see what he didn't believe was possible. He was a creature of the system, and I had become a citizen of the kingdom. "There's nothing here but an old machine," he muttered, turning away in frustration. As they filed out of the room, I stood up. The iron-bound book was empty now. The iridescence had faded from the glass pages, and the violet ink was gone. The energy had been transferred. The seeds were in the storm. The new horizon. I walked out into the square as the sun finally broke over the peaks of the Caucasus. The military teams were packing up, their high-tech sensors failing to find the anomaly they had been sent to suppress. The world looked the same as it had yesterday. The same mountains, the same cold wind. But I knew that underneath the surface, a fundamental change had occurred. The dominance of the institutional model was ending. People were no longer satisfied with legal transactions and doctrinal obedience. They were hungry for something deeper, something that would help them encounter the sacred directly. And now, they had the map. They had the practices of the 40 days, the methods for purifying the heart and awakening to their true nature as children of God. As I made my way toward the border, I thought of Brother Malachi and the ancient monks in their mountain fortresses. They had done their job. They had protected the truth when the world was too violent and too narrow to receive it. They had waited for 2026, a time when the old institutions were crumbling and the human soul was finally ready to reclaim its sovereignty. The history of the world would have to be rewritten, not because of a new discovery, but because of a remembered truth. The story of the other version, the mystical, transformative, and dangerous version of the faith, was now the property of everyone. If you have felt that same hunger for something more than what the modern world offers, if you believe that there are deeper layers to our history and our potential, then you are already part of this awakening. To ensure that these forgotten truths continue to emerge from the shadows and that the keepers of the light are never silenced again, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this story. every interaction helps scatter these seeds further, reaching those who are still searching for a path in the dark. I looked back at the monastery one last time. It was invisible now, lost in the clouds. But I didn't need to see it. I could hear it. I could hear the heartbeat of the world. And for the first time in 17 centuries, it was beating in sync with my own. The silence was ending. The word was out. And the kingdom was, as it had always been, right here.